So good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle. It is 12 o'clock today, so we're going to begin with our program. We would request that if you're joining us at home, if you will please remain muted throughout the program. Also, too, if you have questions from the home, if you will please chat, please type your question in the chat session, and we will get to your questions at the end of the program. We would like to welcome our in-person guests today too. We are delighted. This is probably one of the larger groups that we have had in person for quite a while. So we are very excited about our program today. Before we get started with our guest speaker today, I'm just going to send out a reminder that we will not have a history for lunch for the month of December. Our next history for lunch is scheduled for January the 5th. We'll have Dr. Glenn Bowman from Elizabeth City State University talking, and he will be presenting, he will do the second part of his talk from July on Pasquotank Public Schools. But today we would like to welcome Mr. Bill Barber. He will be talking about Buffalo City and the Blount patent, a history of logging the Dare Mainland. Of course, we will be discussing about the history of land used by entrepreneurs and speculators on the mainland portion of Dare County. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Barber today. We're going to go ahead and share the screen, and we will be ready to go.
Thank you, Lori. I want to thank the Museum of Albemarle for inviting me here today to talk about the history of the timber business in Dare County. How many folks here, just a raise of hands, how many folks have ever heard of Buffalo City? Well, I say just about everybody. Hardly anybody's not there. I've lived and worked in Eastern North Carolina for over 40 years. My father was from Washington County. My father's family was from Washington County. My mother's family was she was an Ambrose, and they stretched from Terrell to Dare County. And I grew up hearing stories about Buffalo City. And over the years, I became curious about what really happened at Buffalo City, and that's what led me to kind of pull all this together to try and separate fact from fiction, from legend, from folklore. I need to what? I need to step all the way back here?
If you can.
Okay. All right.
Sorry.
Okay. All right. What we're going to talk about here today is the history of logging on the Dare Mainland. And I'm not going to be talking so much about life in Buffalo City. If you're interested in what it was like to live in Buffalo City, Suzanne Tate wrote a very informative book called Logs and Moonshine, where she interviewed a lot of people that lived there as children, and she has their recollections recorded. Also at the Outer Banks History Center, Brian Edwards did a digital audio recording of people that had lived at Buffalo City, mostly as children back in the 20s. And that's available for you to hear at the Outer Banks History Center. So if you're interested in the day-to-day life and what happened in Buffalo City, I would certainly encourage you to go to those two resources. What I am going to talk about today is the timber business behind the rise and fall of what at the time was Dare County's largest industry, and Buffalo City was the largest community in Dare County. If you're not familiar, which I think most all of you probably will be familiar, but if you're here, we are in Elizabeth City. Here's Edenton. Here's Columbia. This is Mania. This stretch of 64 that runs all the way across on your way to the beach, if you happen to travel that way, once you leave the Alligator River, between East Lake and Mans Harbor is going to be the focus of what we're talking about today, is that lonely stretch of swampy wilderness that you hope you don't have a flat tire or you don't break down on. See if I can get this right. Yeah, right, there we go, right there. The area was part of what was considered the Great Alligator Dismal Swamp, and it actually covered both sides of the Alligator River and ran all the way back to the west, almost to Lake Phelps. It was formerly known as the Daryl Peninsula, but when Dare County was formed in 1870, it became known then, that became part of Dare County. It became known by most people as the Dare Mainland. Edmund Ruffin was a pioneer in Southern agriculture, and he traveled over much of this region in the 1850s. He's considered the father of soil science, and he was really interested in improving agriculture and things that people could do here in eastern North Carolina to improve their productivity. And he wrote this in 1861 about the eastern end of the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula. Yet there is no equal space of territory in all the states of the American Union that has been so little visited or seen by other than its residents, and of which the character and values have been so little noticed or known. It is rare that any strangers enters this terra incognito. Since the early 1700s, English settlers had drifted onto the Daryl Peninsula, across the Alligator River and across the Albemarle Sound. And these settlers were not farmers or necessarily homesteaders. They were shinglers, men who made wooden shingles. They were hunters and they were trappers. They split shingles and they traded in furs and wild game. These hardy outdoorsmen spent much of their time in this isolation, this wilderness that was then part of Terrell County. Those people were often referred to as either shingle getters, shinglers, or simply swampers. Following the American Revolution, North Carolina was broke. They needed money. And they found that there was a lot of land, vast tracts of swampland in the eastern part of the state along the coast that no one owned. No one had filed any kind of a claim on them, and they were basically vacant lands. So North Carolina developed a process of which, for a fee, you could make an entry for a land grant for a certain number of acres along the coast, along these big swampy areas. The catch was, is once you acquired this patent, so to speak, you then had to pay taxes on it. It was just the state's way of trying to get this land on the tax rolls so they could get revenue from the taxes. By 1795, there was it really kind of reached its peak. There were a lot of people buying up a lot of these vacant lands in eastern North Carolina. And what attracted them to these lands was not so much the land itself, because the land essentially was worthless. People didn't have the technology at that time to road these lands or to ditch them and drain them. They were interested in these lands primarily because of the timber that was there. And it was Atlantic white cedar, what locally people called juniper. It was a very valuable wood. It had a lot of uses. It was rot resistant, weather resistant. They used it for making shingles for roofs, shingles for sidings on houses. It was commonly used in boat building, and they made a lot of barrels and barrel staves out of it. So it was a very valuable wood, and that's what attracted these speculators to invest in this land. Was not the land itself, but was the timber that was on the land. Between 1768 and 1776, over 6 million handmade shingles are exported from North Carolina, most to the West Indies. That shows you how big this trade was in white cedar shingles. John Gray Blount was from Beaufort County. He was a man of many business interests. He was a merchant. He ran a shipping business. He operated sawmills. He operated grist mills. He took great interest in the financial possibilities of acquiring some of these tracts of swampland. On September 7th, 1795, he took a bold step and he made an entry for the entire Daryl Peninsula. Patent number 644. It was estimated the acreage was about 100,000. So he ended up with paying for 100,000 acres of land. It excluded about 22,000 acres that have previously been granted, and most of these sites were along Milltail Creek and Whipping Creek. There were about 22,000 acres of individual smaller grants that had taken place in there for people that were trying to get into the shingle business and juniper business. But this is the scope of the Blount patent. It started at the head of Long Shoal River here, goes all the way across to the Alligator River, up the Alligator River. It excludes Durance Island, goes around the point, northern point, comes back down Croatan Sound, all the way back down into Long Shoal River. It was about, by their estimate at the time, which was really low, we'll see as we go along, it was about 100,000 acres. After that point in time, what had formerly been called the Daryl Peninsula now became known as the Blount Patent, and some people called it the Blount Survey. Today, much of this land is most commonly referred to as the Dare Mainland, but all the way up into the 1990s, I still ran across people who referred to it as the Blount Patent. So that name, the Blount Patent, stood for many, many years. But to keep this empire, this huge amount of land and other lands that John Gray Blount had made interest for, he needed cash. He had to pay the taxes. That was the whole catch in this thing, was I've got this land, but now I've got to pay taxes to the state. A British traveler, Charles Jansen, was on his way up the Pamlico Sound in a sailing vessel in 1807. A squall line came up, or there was some heavy weather, so they took refuge in Long Shoal River. And Long Shoal, there we go, Long Shoal River. They went up to the head of Long Shoal River to try and avoid this bad weather, this storm that was blowing up. And when they got there, they found a camp of about 60 enslaved people. They had been sent there by John Gray Blount to dig a canal from the head of Long Shoal River to Whipping Creek. They lived in thatched huts that were built on top of stumps that were trees that they had fallen along the edge of the marsh. And their weekly rations consisted of salted herrings and a peck of Indian corn on the cob. Canal digging was regarded as the hardest and most grueling work that any person could do in eastern North Carolina. But the purpose of the canal was not for drainage. The purpose of the canal was for two things. One, to provide access into the Blount Patent in order to begin cutting some of the cedar. And the other purpose was to provide a boat passage, which shows up on this map all the way into 1865. It still shows up. Blount and many other men had also taken grants further to the west up to the head of Alligator River. And so by digging this canal from Whipping Creek to Long Shoal River, as they were bringing logs out, instead of having to go all the way around here to go back down to Ocracoke, which was the main port at that time, they could use this boat passage to shortcut it and go into the Long Shoal River. So we had two reasons for digging the canal. One was to provide access for a shingle making operation, and the second was as a boat passage. Probably knowing Mr. Blount, he probably had ideas of charging a toll to go through there because he had some expense involved. But he needed cash for taxes. His plan was to access those 100,000 acres in the Blount Patent and generate enough cash that he could at least pay his property tax, annual property tax, and hold on to the property. In the meantime, John Gray Blount had partnered with John Wallace. And here at Ocracoke Inlet, they built what was referred to as Shell Castle, which was a lightering station. Now, a lightering station was a series of wharves and warehouses where ocean-going vessels that came through Ocracoke Inlet could stop. They had a deep draft. They couldn't go up the sounds. They could stop and offload cargo there at the warehouses. And in turn, they could pick up things that folks had brought down to the lightering station to export out. Then shallow draft boats would come and pick up what was necessary to go to New Bern, or to go to Edenton, or to go to Washington, wherever they might want to go. So most of the traffic and the sounds were on these shallow draft vessels. And the lightering station served as that transfer point between the two. So Blount began operations here at the head of Longshore River, where the canal had been dug. The route was about 40 miles to Shell Castle and Ocracoke Inlet. Blount cut thousands of shingles and shipped them from Longshore River to Ocracoke Inlet to Shell Castle. But things changed. Two events changed that would reverse the flow of wood as it was coming out of the Blount patent. By 1812, Shell Castle was pretty much a derelict. It had been damaged a lot in storms, and as often happens in these inlets, the channel that was once very close to where they had constructed the wharves had migrated away. So now they had shallow water to deal with to get ships up to it. The buildings, the warehouses, a lot of that had been damaged, and it didn't seem like it was worthwhile to repair or try and continue their operation there. Primarily because in 1805, the Dismal Swamp Canal opened. So now all this timber that's here on the Blount patent on the Alligator River could move north up the Pasquotank River, up the Dismal Swamp Canal, to Norfolk, to the deep water ports in Chesapeake Bay. So that reversed the whole idea of cutting and removing that wood and bringing it south to all of a sudden now it needs to go north. But when we talk about cutting timber, it was a very difficult job in those days. For white cedar, they generally cut the logs and they rolled them. They didn't, now remember, they didn't have any mechanized equipment. The land in most cases was too spongy for any kind of draft animals or any oxen or anything like that to pull them. So it was all done by hand. They would lay these runners down, cut poles and lay the runners down. Then they would cut the trees, buck the logs off, move them over by hand to these runners, and they would then roll these logs out by hand, usually to the closest creek or body of water, because everything was moved by water in those days. There was no roads, it had to go by water. So all those logs had to be moved by hand and they had to get to the water. This photograph was taken in 1923. They were still rolling juniper logs in the Great Dismal Swamp in 1923. Later on, in a few years, they developed what was called a tramway. And a tramway, the first tramways were basically wooden railroads. The rails were made out of wood. There was a cart that they called a log truck that they put the logs on, and it was pulled by a mule. It was a vast improvement over the old rolling the logs, and allowed them to build these tramways deeper into the woods, because it was the mule power now that was bringing those logs out, not men having to roll it. So they were able to extend the tram lines deeper into the woods. But the real change for logging came with the advent of steam power. Steam came to the woods probably in the late 1880s, and a steam skidder, like you see here, was used to pull logs to the rail line. It was a steam boiler and a couple of winches with cables that they would hook the logs, and they can now pull those logs to the rail line and then lift them and load them onto log trucks or rail cars and take them to the landing. While the steam skidder provided much of the muscle to get those logs out of the woods up to the rail line, it was the steam locomotive that was the real backbone behind logging in the 1880s and 1890s. It was the steam locomotive that pulled those flat cars loaded with logs, either to the mill or to the river, where they'd be dumped in the water. And it allowed them to push deeper and deeper into that untapped wilderness where they had mainly been confined to just cutting timber around the edges. Now they could run these rail lines deep into the woods, and they could cut timber and deliver to the mills at rates that had never been seen before. In 1873, a company by the name of Barber, Roper and Company, which eventually would become the John L. Roper Lumber Company. And John L. Roper Lumber Company would be one of the largest lumber concerns on the East Coast by 1900. They bought the Blount patent. By 1874, Roper had 200 men working along Milltail Creek, cutting juniper and trying to get it into the creek and out to their mills. They also had contractors, at least two contractors. One was A. Doe, who was out of Manio or Dare County, and another contractor was D.F. Sykes out of Terrell County. They both ran large logging crews as well. By 1885, Roper sells the Blount patent to an outfit called Albemarle and Pamlico Colonization Company. Now, this is a group out of Buffalo, New York. It's led by a local man, William H. White. He lived in Norfolk, but most of the investors in the company were from the Buffalo area. And their plan, or so they said their plan, was this was right at the peak of the mass immigration from Europe. Thousands and thousands of immigrants were coming into the United States every year in the 1880s and 1890s. These were legal immigrants coming through Ellis Island. Their idea was to buy this big chunk of land, divide it up into farms, and sell it off to all these immigrants that were coming into the country. Now, whether they actually knew what they were buying, if you're familiar with this part of the world at all, it's just not suitable farmland. But they had the idea that it was going to be suitable farmland, so that was their whole purpose of supposedly was to provide places for these immigrants to be able to live. And their purchase was financed by banks in Buffalo, New York. Another player, Richmond Cedar Works, they start buying some of those 22,000 acres of patents that were prior to the Blount patent. They have an interest now in the Dare mainland. Richmond Cedar Works had a huge factory up in Richmond, Virginia, and they made woodenware products. They made buckets and tubs and clothespins and wooden spoons and anything that you could use around the house that was made out of wood. Butter churns, washing machines, that's what they made. They really weren't in the lumber business, they were in the woodenware business. And they had been operating for many years in the Great Dismal Swamp, and the timber was really getting scarce up there. So they looked where else we can find white cedar, and it was the Alligator River. So that's the reason they came down and started buying up some of those early patents. In 1887, for some reason, they didn't hold it on very long. I don't know whether they finally realized what they had or not, but the Albemarle Pamlico Colonization sells the Blount patent to Eastern Carolina Land, Lumber, and Manufacturing Company. Now, these people, I think, really have an interest in doing something. They established a sawmill on the north side of Milltail Creek. But in 1889, even after they had established the sawmill, they leased the land. Now, they're not selling the mill. They leased the land to a company called Acme Wood and Fiber Company. They leased the Blount patent to these people. And who they leased it to is a fellow by the name of Andrew Brown. Now, Andrew Brown wears two hats. He's president of Eastern Carolina Land, Lumber, and Manufacturing Company, and he's also president of Acme Wood and Fiber. Now, this was in the days before, this was unbridled capitalism. This was in the days before there were any regulations. You could be an officer in one company and an officer in a competing company, and you can buy and sell land and timber on your own. You can buy it from this. Anything went. These guys could do pretty much what they wanted to. So Brown is an Englishman. He's born in England in 1832 to Scottish parents. His father is an attorney. They moved to Brooklyn in 1860 and eventually end up in Buffalo, New York in 1875. He's married, has a couple of children. His occupation is listed as a timber dealer while he's in Buffalo. In 1890, he's president of both companies. The one that owns the Blount patent and leased it to his other company that he's also president of. But why Buffalo? What was so important about Buffalo? Buffalo, New York was located at the eastern end of Lake Erie. All the Great Lakes flowed to that point. So logs, barges of logs, rafts of logs, all of it naturally made its way to Buffalo because what separated Lake Erie from Lake Ontario was Niagara Falls. That was as far as you could go by water was Buffalo. And a little town developed there called North Tonawanda that really became kind of the lumber log capital of the Great Lakes. And they had all kinds of sawmills and stuff up there. And the whole area was filled with timbermen and the lumber business. And so all the banks and all the financing up there understood what the lumber business was all about and the timber business was all about. And so when these fellows started moving south for looking for more land to invest in, they of course went back to their bankers in Buffalo who knew them and knew something about the timber industry. So it was a natural fit, but that's why we see the influence of Buffalo here in the Daryl Mainland or the Blount patent. In 1889, to make this thing work, the way Brown worked this thing out, he sells to the Bank of Commerce in Buffalo, New York, all the juniper logs in the boom at the mill at Buffalo City, plus all rafted and cut logs. Now, rafted logs are logs that are in the water, bound to chains, and they're ready to pull. Cut logs are logs that have been cut in the woods, but have yet to be either loaded on a tram liner or rolled to the water. All equipment, including furniture in the boarding house, office, and other buildings. And the equipment list is 1 narrow gauge locomotive, 2 boats, and 6 mules. Now, why would a bank in Buffalo, New York want to buy all this raw material? They're not buying any land at all. They're just buying the mill and all the logs that have been cut. What would be their interest in it? Acme Wood and Fiber Company, he turns around within a few weeks and he borrows $8,000 from the Bank of Commerce in Buffalo, New York. What do you think he does with that money that he's borrowed? He buys back all that stuff that the Bank of Commerce had originally bought. So it was a way of him getting control back into his company of all the equipment, the sawmill equipment and the logging equipment that was formerly belonged to the Eastern Carolina Company. And this was in a place called Buffalo City on Milltail Creek. And this is the earliest mention that I can find of the name Buffalo City in any kind of written document. The community that was there before was called Daredevil, but they changed the name from Daredevil to Buffalo City. And Buffalo City in 1889 was what the area became known as. And just to show you how much this had grown just in a few years, they now had storehouses, sheds, engines, Excelsior machines, all kinds of stuff. I mean, they had really grown the business there. Andrew Brown was president of both. Acme Wood and Fiber owned the manufacturing side. Eastern Carolina owned the timberland. So, Acme basically takes over the manufacturing business, but their sawmill burns in the one there at Buffalo City burns in 1891. Brown rebuilds the sawmill, but when he rebuilds the sawmill, for some reason, he changes the name. He doesn't keep the name Acme. He now names the company Buffalo City Mills Limited. After Brown operates it for about 8 years. And after 8 years, I don't know whether he grew tired of it or they saw other opportunities, but he leases it to a fellow here in Elizabeth City whose name was Edward H. Kruger. Now, Kruger was also an Englishman, and it was speculated by some that Kruger and Brown were related, that they were by marriage, that they thought they were brother-in-laws, but I never found that to be any proof of it, but there was some speculation that they were related. So Brown operates it for 8 years, leases it to Kruger. And in those 8 years, this is what the lease included. You can see now what they have there. There's a hotel, there's a schoolhouse, which means there's families there. There's families living there with small children. There's a schoolhouse, store and fixtures. There's a hotel now located east of the store, office building and dwelling houses. He's now gone from 6 mules to 18 trucks, which trucks means the flatbed cars, flatbed log trucks, small boats, rafting gear, and a blacksmith shop. Kruger also bought all the lumber that was on the yard. He bought this as a bill of sale, straight out. He didn't lease this, he bought this. There was 800,000 feet of plank and boards, plus pickets and laths. Now, pickets, of course, were used for making fences. Laths were, at that point in time, this was before wallboard. These were thin, narrow strips of wood that they nailed up on the studs that they plastered over. And that was what gave you your interior finish on a house, was lath and plaster. But it's interesting to note that there's a hotel here now, and there's a schoolhouse here now. Kruger doesn't hold it long, about a year, and he sells the lease to a fellow named Thomas Lovegrove, except Thomas Lovegrove is not from Buffalo. Thomas Lovegrove is from Philadelphia. He holds it, Lovegrove holds it just for a short period of time, and he ends up selling it in 1887. Well, let me back up. He buys the lease, and then he buys Buffalo City Mills from Andrew Brown. He pesters him enough that Andrew Brown says, okay, I'll sell it to you. So he sells it to him, and he didn't hold it on for just a month or two, and he sells it to this new outfit called East Coast Cedar. In 1902, the East Carolina Land and Lumber Manufacturing Company defaulted. They finally went broke. Their land, the Blount patent, was now sold to an outfit called East Lake Lumber Company. Now, East Lake Lumber Company was run still by another group out of Buffalo. They were still Buffalo people, but the title to the Blount patent transferred from Eastern Carolina to East Lake Lumber. In 1904, Andrew Brown decides he's going to get back in the timber business. So he actually goes back and he buys back the Buffalo City Mills manufacturing and their timberland, and he reestablishes Buffalo City Mills. In the meantime, East Coast Cedar had moved the shingle making operation here to Elizabeth City, which was a big move because everything had been done there at Buffalo City, but they knew the railroad was here. The railroad came in 1881. They saw a real advantage to having the railroad here, so they moved the railroad here. In 1881, they moved the shingle operation over here at that time. Brown bought both the timberland, the logging equipment, and the shingle mill, everything. By that same period of time, Richmond Cedar Works, which was still operating on the Daryl mainland, had now become the world's largest manufacturer of woodenware. Buckets, tubs, spoons, clothespins, whatever you wanted, they made it, and they made lots of them. In 1905, a new player shows up on the line. East Lake Lumber evidently didn't have the capital to pursue the timber that they had bought on the Blount patent. So they worked out a deal with an outfit called Daryl Lumber Company, which was not out of Buffalo. Daryl Lumber Company was run by a man named Hotchkiss out of Binghamton, New York. And they entered into a 51-year lease So East Lake Lumber owned the property, but they had essentially leased everything there, the land, everything there to Daryl Lumber Company in 1905. Daryl Lumber Company, the officials came here to Elizabeth City and they had a dilemma. Where are we going? They were determined they were going to build this big state-of-the-art brand new sawmill to cut all this timber that was on the Blount patent. Well, the dilemma was, where are we going to build it? Are we going to build it at East Lake on the Blount patent? If we build it there, we can rail the logs straight into the mill, but then we got to take all the lumber and it's got to be loaded on a barge and we've got to rail it out. And there's not a whole lot of people over there. We'd have to import labor. Or we're going to build it here in Elizabeth City, which there's a railroad already here. We can tie into the railroad. There's probably enough labor here. So they set up a little competition between the two communities, between East Lake and Elizabeth City. Well, it didn't go very far. People at East Lake basically were unconcerned about it. They realized that there wasn't enough people there at East Lake to man this mill. They were, I won't say they were a clannish group, but they had lived in isolation so long, they enjoyed their privacy and their isolation. And they didn't think that it would be good for the community to bring in 200 or 300 outsiders into their community. So they basically didn't, they said, we don't really want any part of it. And they didn't think there was enough timber there to support the mill. And so they pretty much turned their shoulder on Mr. Hotchkiss and said, we don't want your mill. Well, the people in Elizabeth City, of course, they just couldn't wait. They threw parties and they did everything they could to entertain these officials from Daryl Lumber. They even had one local citizen that volunteered to give them a mill site. And so, you know what they decided? They decided we're going to build in Elizabeth City. They were going to build this mill out of concrete. It was going to operate on electric motors. Now, the electric motors were going to be, the generators were still steam powered, but they were going to run steam powered 6 100 horsepower steam boilers to generate electricity for these electric motors. They planned to saw 30 million board feet a year. Most of this was going to be pine. They had storage under sheds for 8 million board feet. They could cut 50,000 shingles a day. They had a lath mill and a shook factory. Now, a shook factory was a barrel making factory. They found that if you made barrels and assembled them and you shipped them, you shipped a whole lot of air because, you know, you had a barrel and there was nothing but air inside. So what they did was they started making these shook kits, which was the barrel collapsed, wrapped up, so you could buy a kit and then you could assemble it when you got it to your facility. It made shipping a whole lot better. So they had a shook factory. They were going to employ 200 men in the mill. They were going to employ another 250 men in the logging operation and their barges. And this is the mill after they built it. And the waterfront of Elizabeth City was filled. You had the Foremans, the Blades, the Kramers, they all had mills along the waterfront. Charles Creek was full, Knobs Creek was full. There was really nowhere to build this mill. So they went further upriver, just a short ways past Knobs Creek upriver, and they built it on a site there. The site today is the site of the wastewater treatment plant. So if you stand downtown Elizabeth City and you look up the river and you see those little white buildings way up the river up there, that's where Daryl Lumber Company was located. But a transition began in manufacturing and moving from Buffalo City to Elizabeth City. East Coast Cedar had moved the shingle operation. Daryl Lumber Company had now just built this brand new modern state-of-the-art mill that was going to take all the logs off the off the Blount patent and bring them to Elizabeth City. The railroad was here. Everything was set that Elizabeth City was going to benefit tremendously from a lot of this new wood that was coming into the system. Between 1880 and 1920, there were over 40 forest products companies in Elizabeth City. They made veneer, lumber, shingles, barrels, baskets, trays, and crates. Elizabeth City at the time was the leading lumber exporting port in North Carolina. So how are they going to get all these logs from the Mainland, from the Blount patent to Elizabeth City? In 1910, the old loading facilities that Eastern Carolina had built burned to the ground, destroyed all the steam-powered equipment, all the hoist, everything was gone. So all the timber that was to be cut on the Blount patent had to come by water to Elizabeth City. There were no highways, there were no bridges, it had to come by water. So Daryl Lumber had to figure out a way to load barges with logs to get them across the Albemarle Sound as opposed to rafting them. Rafting them was something that had been done years ago, and people really wanted to get out of the rafting business. It was the rafts sometimes would break up in bad weather and logs pull out, and it was just a mess. They really wanted to go to the barges. So they developed what you see here, which was referred to as the transfer. And it was a huge machine built on the north shore of Milltail Creek. The rail cars could basically come in. See right here, that rail cars could come in. They could put cables around the logs on the rail car. They could lift them up with their derrick and they could swing it over and drop it on the barge or place it on the barge. So instead of having to tong each log by hand, they could take them all and put them on the barge at one time. It was a really an ingenious thing, and it lasted there for many years. This is a picture of Daryl Lumber Company's tug Pamlico pulling a barge that's loaded with logs. That's was called the Daredevil. Now, if you look here in the background, you'll see this is the transfer. He's pulling out of the transfer, pulling that barge loaded logs out of the transfer. There's the boom and the derrick that you see here. So it's they're just exiting the transfer. Life on at Buffalo City for the logging crews began each morning at 6 a.m., 6 days a week. The train pulled into the main street of Buffalo City. Buffalo City had no main street. There were railroad tracks and houses on both sides. The train would pull in there at the end of the day. At 6 a.m., they would blow the whistle one time. That was to get everybody awake, out of bed, knowing the work day is getting ready to start. They had a man who was a night watchman. His name was D.H. Hassel. Now, Mr. Hassel's job, because all this was steam powered, Mr. Hassel's job was to travel around at night and keep these boilers on these steam skidders, to keep these boilers hot and to keep the locomotive hot. Because if you ever let those things cool down, particularly in the wintertime, it took you some time to heat them back up so they had enough steam pressure to work. And Daryl Lumber Company wanted these machines ready to go. As they said, they wanted them sizzling when the crews showed up ready to go. So that's what Hassel did, was he traveled around at night, stoking these things, keeping them going. At 7 o'clock, train made 3 blasts on the whistle. That meant we're leaving, we're going out. And they would take men out, back down all the way back around to the different logging sites. Their lumber company employed about 180 men in their logging operation. Buffalo City Mills employed about 150 men in their logging operations. By 1911, their lumber company found themselves in another dilemma. Most of the timber on the north side of Milltail Creek, which is where the transfer was located, where the town was located, where all their equipment, blacksmith shops, everything was located. Most of that timber was gone. All the timber now on the Blount patent was south of Milltail Creek. And the dilemma was, what are we going to do? Are we going to move all of our equipment and set up a new base of operation on the south side of Milltail Creek? How are we going to handle this? Well, they decided they were going to build a bridge, and they built a drawbridge across Milltail Creek. And when they did that, they then could expand their rail line. Here's Buffalo City. They could then expand this is where they built the drawbridge. They could then expand their rail line all the way down 16 miles to Whipping Creek and to the Alligator River. They referred to it as the McRae line, and they ran spurs off of that line all on the way south. And this is just a quick view of what it looked like on the waterfront of Buffalo City when Daryl Lumber Company was operating it. Here's the transfer. See the big boom. They had 3 rail lines coming in. This was a blacksmith. They had a blacksmith shop. They had a machine shop. They had a roundhouse. one of these rails eventually will run to what was referred to as the pulp mill, but it was quite an operation there along the waterfront. In 1912, by 1912, Buffalo City Mills had had a couple of fires here in Elizabeth City. The shingle mill had been damaged at least twice. Andrew Brown was now in his 70s. And I think he finally decided it was enough. And so he sells to Richmond Cedar Works. Richmond Cedar Works wanted more land. They wanted more white cedar. So he sells to Richmond Cedar Works. But Richmond Cedar Works was smart enough to know what kind of a businessman Andrew Brown was. So he had to sign a non-compete clause that says he would not be in the logging sawmilling business in Virginia, North Carolina, or South Carolina for the next 20 years. So they kind of pushed him out of the picture. They don't want to have him as a competitor again. They had spent a lot of time in court with Mr. Brown on property line disputes and one thing and another. So that was their way of just pushing him out of the picture. Of this whole deal that included all this land and all this equipment, Brown accepted two things. One was a typewriter and the other was a desk at the Buffalo City Mills here in Elizabeth City. And he used those two things in the remaining years of his life to attempt to sue everybody he knew. He sued his lawyers, he sued everybody. He never won as far as I could determine, but he was intent, I guess because his father had been a lawyer, he had enough knowledge of the law. He was intent on just being a thorn in everybody's side. But as far as I know, he never won any of his lawsuits. But the sale included the mill site at Buffalo City, Elizabeth City, and the name Buffalo Brand Machine Dress Shingles. And you see in this 1919 ad that was run by Richmond Cedar Works, they mentioned the celebrated Buffalo Brand white cedar shingles. So they were highly regarded in the marketplace, and it was a real coup for Richmond Cedar Works to be able to have that. But by 1916, Andrew Brown dies. He had moved back to his home in Short Hills, New Jersey. He had lived for a few more years, and as it says in his obituary, at one time owned thousands of acres of pine and juniper in this section, and he had been a leading figure in the lumber business in eastern North Carolina. He disposed of his interest in this section in recent years to the Richmond Cedar Works. He was 77 when he passed away. The decline of Daryl Lumber Company. In March 1907, Daryl Lumber Company issues $6 million in bonds. Now, in those days, it was a way of borrowing money. It probably is today as well, but instead of going to banks, a lot of times they would issue bonds. People would subscribe to a bond, and you would agree to pay them an interest payment on an annual basis, and the bond would go to its maturity, then they'd refund your money. And so they issued or attempted to issue $6 million in bonds. They needed cash. In 1918, their concrete fireproof mill in Elizabeth City burns. In May 17th, 1920, they're in default because of some of these bonds that they had issued. They weren't able to make interest payments. And so they were forced into default. May 21st, 1920, a notice is published here in the Independent for the sale of Daryl Lumber Company and the Blount patent. So it's up now for public auction. All you have to do is show up and bid. And the sale is held at Daryl Lumber Company's property in Buffalo City and Dare County, North Carolina. Sell to the highest bidder. June 19th, 1920, only one bid is placed, and that is by Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Now you wonder, how in the world, what is Metropolitan Life Insurance Company? What would their interest be in the Blount patent and the logging business on the Dare mainland? The key to that is understanding how Daryl Lumber Company failed. There are three figures that were played an important role in this. George F. Montgomery, Clarence F. Birdseye, and his son, Kellogg Birdseye. Clarence F. Birdseye is a disbarred New York attorney. George F. Montgomery, I'm not sure exactly what he had, many jobs. He was everything from a process server to being in the lumber business. And at the time, I think he was living in New York as well. Well, these three concocted a scheme to take advantage of Daryl Lumber Company and an outfit called Pittsburgh Life Insurance Company. There was the relationship between Eastern Carolina Land Lumber Manufacturing Company and Daryl Lumber Company was not very good. Remember, they had leased the Blount patent for 51 years. They were to pay Eastern Carolina Land and Lumber Company a % of their profits they made every year as lease payment. Well, I don't know whether it was legitimate or whether it was a bookkeeping or what, but Daryl Lumber Company never showed a profit. So they never paid a penny to Eastern Carolina, a land and lumber manufacturing company, for all the years that they'd been logging there. So Eastern Carolina, they wanted out. They wanted to sell. Their stockholders said, sell, get out of it. Nobody would buy it because it was encumbered with a 51-year lease. You buy it, you can't do anything with it until the lease runs out. So George F. Montgomery acquired a controlling interest in Daryl Lumber Company. On the same day, he made an offer to purchase the Blount patent from Eastern Carolina. So he pulled the Daryl Lumber Company and the Blount patent together in one unit. On the next day, he issues the $6 million in bonds that we talked about earlier. He put those up for sale. Nobody was going to buy them. At the most, people thought the combination, the Daryl Lumber Company and the Blount patent, it might have been, in 1920, it might have been worth $1 million. Certainly not $6 million. So there were no takers. In the meantime, his partner, Clarence F. Birdseye, goes to Pittsburgh Life Insurance Company, and he makes an offer to the board of directors to buy their stock at an inflated price, well above what the market price was. The only catch was he couldn't pay him for it then. He'd have to pay him in a couple of weeks. They agree. They sell him the controlling interest in Pittsburgh Life Insurance Company. So what they do, he immediately appoints a new board of directors. They immediately go through Pittsburgh Life Insurance Company and they sell off all their assets, everything they can, and they replace them with the $6 million in bonds from the Daryl Lumber Company. So they take these fraudulent bonds and put them in the Pittsburgh Life Insurance Company, take all this extra money and put it in their pockets. In 1917, the Pittsburgh Life Insurance Company fails. They don't have enough resources to pay claims, so they basically fail. The scheme becomes public knowledge, and you see how it took a lot of detailed planning and coordination for this to work. Metropolitan Trust, not Life, was the underwriter of the bonds, and they were the ones that fell heir to the bonds. George F. Montgomery and Clarence Birdseye are sentenced to prison, and they were in the process of investigating the board of directors of Pittsburgh Life to see if maybe they were hooked up in this thing. Metropolitan Life Insurance steps in because at that point in time, life insurance is something that's relatively new in the United States. It's been around for a couple of decades, but Metropolitan Life was the largest life insurance company in America. They had been founded in like 1868, and they were concerned that if Pittsburgh Life folded, that people would lose confidence in the life insurance business and sales would fall off. So they stepped forward and took over the assets of the Pittsburgh Life Insurance Company, which included the bonds that had been let by Montgomery. So when the sale came, Metropolitan Life had no choice, I guess, but to take over the property since they had basically were holding these fraudulent bonds. So their idea was to try and manage this land as best they could over the next several years. In 1922, they contract with a group here in Elizabeth City, Seligman, Williams, and Ball, to continue timber harvesting operations on the Blount Patent. 1923, a fellow named P.R. Easton of Vermont comes here looking to purchase the old mill site, but so much of the equipment has been ruined and gone that he declines. In 1924, Metropolitan decides they're going to, this is a picture of the pulp mill that was built at Buffalo City in 1917. And they think, well, we're going to, by this time, pulp and paper business had really started picking up. Cardboard boxes had been invented around the turn of the century, and the old wooden crates and wooden boxes were gone. And there was a huge demand now for pulp. And so they decided, well, we can get in the pulp business, refire this thing up and make some money. But it was going to cost them something like $175,000 to get this thing back in operation. And I'm not sure that it ever was in operation when when Daryl Lumber owned it. So they gave up on that idea. In 1924, they decided we're going to take a bunch of land on the west side of Stumpy Point. We're going to turn that into farmland. And we're going to sell that off, these 40,000 acres. People can raise blueberries and they can graze cattle and they can do all this stuff over there. Well, the thing they didn't take into account was there was no access to Stumpy Point other than by boat. And people weren't going to come in there and invest money and buy land that the only way they could get to it was by water. So that scheme fell through. And then finally, they ended up going back to the Duval brothers, who were Dare County men, and basically allowed them to erect a sawmill and see what they could do to generate some income for them. But it didn't last for long. Metropolitan Life Insurance in 1940 sells to a company named Dare Corporation. Now, the Dare Corporation had the same idea that Albemarle and Pamlico Colonization Company had. This was run by a lady out of Arkansas. Her name was Mrs. Emily Gilchrist. And she planned to use the Blount Patent to set up all these farms to relocate immigrants that were coming here from Europe at the beginning of the Second World War. And so she saw this as an opportunity to get these immigrants that were fleeing the Germans, the Nazis, and they could settle them here on the bare mainland on the Blount Patent and turn it into productive farms. When Metropolitan sold this to her in 1940, it was the largest single land transaction ever made at that time in the state of North Carolina. It was 167,555 acres, the largest single transaction ever made. But before Mrs. Gilchrist can see her dream come true, she passes away. And in a settlement of the estate, she owed some money to a fellow by the name of Fred Maloff. And they agreed for him to take over control of the Dare Corporation and the Blount Patent in exchange for his claim against the estate. So he did. And he stops all activities, and he has grand plans. We're going to, logging's going to start up. We're going to have sawmills. We're going to have a pulp mill. We're going to go into ranching. We're going to go into fur trapping. We're going to sell hunting leases. We're going to go to blueberry farming. He's got a lot of ideas, but none of them ever really come true. He ends up getting a partner that is the sitting treasurer of the United States. His name is William Alexander Julian. He was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1939. Julian was his business partner. Well, Julian decided he really wanted all of it. He didn't want to be a partner in it. So Maloff had mortgaged part of this property to get some operating money. Well, Julian bought the mortgage. And so he called the mortgage due and was threatening to throw Maloff off and take complete control of it. Well, Maloff was able, I don't know if he got more partners or what happened, but he was able to raise enough money to pay off the mortgage and satisfy his debt, so he was able to keep it. But before they could really get anything going, in 1945, they had a huge wildfire. that burned all the way across the Blount Patent, 80,000 acres. And it pretty much wiped out any hope they had of doing any logging, any timber over there. It pretty much was gone. So in 1952, they sold to West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company. Richmond Cedar Works sold in 1953. So now pretty much everything, the old Blount patent and all those other individual patents, there's still a few of those patents that exist today, but most of them now have been consolidated in one big ownership with West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company. And West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company brings about the kind of the first effort at modern forestry. This is in the early 50s. They build some roads, they put in some drainage, they develop a seed orchard there at Sandy Ridge to try and grow some of their own nursery stock. They practice reforestation on the areas that they've harvested. They plan to ship most of this wood by barge to their mill in Charleston, but that never really happens. Most of the wood is sold locally. But they have a lot of problems. They have a lot of wildfires. They really have wetland that's not suitable for pine forestry, and they struggle with it for a long time. But they finally, as well, give up. And in 1973, they sell to a man named M.P. McLean, who was made a lot of money in the shipping business. And he decided he wanted to own some land. And so he basically bought the Dare County Holdings, which is the Blount Patent. He forms First Colony Farms in 1974. They try to clear some of it. Most of that, as you ride down 64 now on the south side of the road, those farms that you see over there that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife are managing were part of this effort to clear some of this land. In 1983, they had borrowed money from Prudential Life Insurance Company, and that deal kind of fell through. So Prudential Life took over the ownership of the Blount Patent at that time. In 1984, they give it as a gift, as a tax write-off to the United States of America. It becomes what we know today as the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. So it had been in private ownership for 189 years. And there were many, many plans and schemes to harvest the timber and to develop the Blount Patent. But the land that John Gray Blount had acquired all those years ago in 1795 and 1984 returned back to public ownership. Any questions?
Is there any way to get to the site where Buffalo City was? Is there any way to identify it? I mean, is there anything like rail lines still visible or anything like that?
There is, there's no rail lines in the woods. There are some right of ways that you can still see, but you have to know where to look. If you go all the way to the very end of the road, that dead ends where the little kayak landing is, and there's a little bridge there. If you go to the end of the road, there's a pile of bricks at the end of the road. That pile of bricks was the East Carolina sawmill that burned down. You come back up the road a little ways, and if you look really hard back to the west, you can see a little path that runs back into the woods. That path that runs back in the woods was where Buffalo City was located. Remnants of the pulp mill are still there. Remnants of the Duval sawmill are still there. I mean, just bricks and concrete. There's no buildings, no structures. Essentially it's all gone. The transfer, I talked to a fellow who told me that he could remember seeing the transfer there as late as early 50s, and it finally just collapsed in the water. So it's pretty much all gone. Well, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate your time.
See if we have any questions. I'll ask our guests that are joining us on Zoom. Do you have any questions for us today? Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Like I said, this is probably one of our larger attendances for in person. So we're excited that we had so many guests today. And we thank everyone at home that has joined us today too. And we hope you have enjoyed, and thank you, Mr. Barber, for coming. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.